This video will continue on with our CSS discussions. So we talked about the CSS rule and how that is made up of a selector, which is what we want to modify, and the declaration says what we're doing to that selector. And then within the selection or within the declaration, we had the property and value defining what our settings would be. So when we think about CSS, we use it to modify tons and tons of things in our sites. But something that is super handy for you will be modifying colors and modifying your typography. So thinking about defining color, how we define color with CSS, you can actually do that 3 different ways. So you can establish that through entering an RGB value. So this is where an RGB chart comes in handy. You can find one online. We'll give you color codes, breakdowns. So this is our RGB values. You can define it through a hex code. So again, having a hex code color chart, very handy. Hex codes are those 6 digits and letters that refer to a color. And then you can even have CSS recognizes a good range of color names, okay? So if you want to look up CSS color names, there's charts for that online as well. You can't just enter random colors. I mean, it might get pretty close. There are specific names that CSS responds to, but for example, if you type dark cyan, that will give you kind of a deeper, darker cyan color to define your color. So we can define color 3 ways: RGB, hex code, and by typing a color name. All right, so let's take a look at that. We can also define opacity. So for example here, our background color, we're doing this with our RGB. So we're telling it that the RGB, this will be black. Okay, so we have RGB. And then if we want to define opacity, we add a opacity declaration, and then we add our level of opacity. Okay, so again, this property denotes that we're modifying the opacity color of the background color. And with opacity, opacity can be a number between 0 and 1.0. So the value of 0.5 that we have here is 50% opacity. So that would be kind of like a grayed out color. But essentially we could just set the background color to be gray. But this is showing you how to establish an opacity of a color. So color demo, we'll do that in class. Thinking of text. So how do we modify text with CSS? Specifying typefaces, okay? So when we're specifying typefaces, so for example, we wanted to specify the type family for the whole body of our web page, right? We would use the property font family, which allows you to specify the typeface that should be used. And then in the font family, we're going to give it some options. We're going to say Georgia, comma, Times, comma, serif. So what this is saying is that our preference is Georgia. If the browser has to default to Times, that's okay. And then serif. So we know that we want it to be a serif font. So again, what if the user or browser doesn't have my typeface? You can specify a list of fonts separated by commas in case the user does not have your first choice of typeface installed, or if the browser can't read it. The browser can try to use an alternate from the list. So again, thinking about different users, different browsers, different technologies they may have or not have, we want to make sure that we give some options to make sure that our page shows up as close as we intended as possible. So using web fonts alleviates a lot of this problem because it can actually pull the font directly from the web rather than having to rely on just the browser or the user's system. So the size of a typeface. So here, thinking about the CSS rules, we have our font family property. We're defining that. Then we have the font size. So we would use font size property and define that in pixels. So font size enables you to specify a size for the font. And pixels are commonly used for the web. So 16 pixels is the default size of text in most browsers. Font weight and style. So thinking about the weight and the style, here again, we have our font family. And if we want to modify that even more, we would say font weight, and we could default that to bold. Okay. Font weight allows you to control the visual weight of the text. So for example, if you want it to be bold or if you want it to be normal, bold italic, right? Depending on what attributes your type family has, you could specify that. So again, thinking about font weight and style, if you use your font style property, you can say that something needs to be italic. So font style essentially allows you to create and specify italics in your CSS rules. Again, there's probably not going to be a large use for having like a whole paragraph or something italic, but just letting you know that you can control these things universally. Now, if it was just like 1 or 2 words that you wanted to be italic, you'd be better off just setting that in your HTML in that very isolated particular area. All right, letting, line, and word spacing. So again, using CSS to control your spacing. So again, with CSS, we're not doing this just once, right? Like if we do CSS, that's modifying whatever we tell it to modify. So if we're modifying the body of the web page, that's the body of all the web pages in our site. So if we're setting certain spacing, that could actually be consistent throughout the whole site, and we only have to do that once in our CSS. So the CSS really does a lot of the work for you and mass applies these options. So thinking of, for our print design folks, in InDesign, we have our character styles and paragraph styles that can be universally applied. That is essentially what CSS is doing, only on the internet. So leading, so line height, if we're using the line height property, that dictates the leading, so the line spacing between lines. We could set that to ems, so line height is measured in what we call ems, which is just a web-based measurement, okay? Letter spacing. So again, letter spacing is going to be our property, and that is going to control your kerning. Okay, so maybe for your headers, you want to apply a certain amount of kerning universally, you would use the letter spacing property to do so. Word spacing, same thing. So you're tracking, essentially, you would use the word spacing property, and that would control your spacing between words. Text alignment. So again, you can control text alignment universally with your CSS. So text alignment, for example, here, this is our header. We want to set text alignment to left, and that will left align everything. Your alignment options, you can text align center, text align right, and text align justify. So one thing to keep in mind though, if you are specifying that you want to left align all your headers, that's going to do it for anything that is an H1. All right. There are ways if you want to change that or make specific adjustments to just certain areas. There are particular ways to do that, but this is just getting you introduced to how CSS can universally control everything. Vertical alignment. Vertical alignment is changed just a little bit, but you can have a good amount of control of it with your CSS if you use, again, vertical align text top. So here, this will align to the top. If you use the baseline, it will align to the baseline of your text or objects. And then if you use the text bottom, it will align to the bottom. So baseline and text bottom don't look too different, but it will align to what is a true baseline rather than like the bottom. So the text bottom is more for maybe you have some text and some objects, that might be a better fit, okay? So links, styling links with CSS. So maybe we don't want our links to just look like a plain, blue underlined link. We can use CSS to style all of our links throughout our website. So again, styling a link, if we're just styling a general link, we will use the A link selector. This indicates styling for a basic link. So whatever your links look like normally on your website. Let's say, for example, we're using your navigation links in your header. All of those will be styled like a basic link. Maybe after something has been visited, to indicate to the user that it's been visited, we want it to change color. We would set the visited setting for those links. Maybe when we hover over it, we want something to change about it. You could use the hover selector to indicate what the hover looks like. And then for your active links, so those links that you are actually still on, you would use this selector to indicate that. All right, so this is where these three here is where it becomes more of a user interface, thinking about the user and how they'll navigate through the site and use the links. But you will almost always have at least the A link selector that will style what your links look like throughout your site. Okay, so again, demo, we'll kind of talk more about styling links in class. And that is, you guys, just thinking about basic CSS and jumping off from there.